everyone. My name is Shawn, and welcome to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Hello, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying your autumn so far. Here we are with our 10th episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. And with this episode, just like our last, I'll be discussing some of the work of J.R.R. Tolkien and how he drew inspiration from various Norse myths and sagas in those works. For right now, I'm just focusing on the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. In our last episode, we followed the trail of ring bearers of the Cursed Ring and Varanat, and how its bearers, starting with a dwarf, went from gods to dragons to kings, Valkyries to princesses, and for a brief time a royal messenger, then to other kings before being hidden at the bottom of the Rhine River in Western Europe. That ring, cursed by the dwarf Andvari, and due to the greed of the god Loki, eventually corrupts its future wielders and echoes across time to inspire Tolkien's One Ring, which also corrupts those that hold it. And yes, I did go a bit into the role that fate played in the ring's progression from myth to history, as I discussed the role of the Norns in the Norse myths, who guide the fates of both gods and men. Some Norns, per the Eddas, do have specific connections to dwarves, and they serve as the first movers of Andvari the dwarf's fate, and his eventual curse and loss of Envaranat before it shaped the fates of the House of Volsung and their own tragic ending. So that episode serves as a bridge to this episode, where later we will go briefly to the Misty Mountains of Middle-earth to discuss the change of ring bearers for the One Ring, forged by Sauron in the fires of Mount Doom. From the creature Gollum to a certain friendly face, and I mean who does not love Martin Freeman's face, belonging to Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit on an unexpected journey with Gandalf and many dwarves, in which he would find himself as the ring bearer of Sauron's ring for decades, shaping his life in the history of Middle-earth as well. If you remember Gandalf's words from the film The Fellowship of the Ring, he says to Frodo, "The ring wants to be found," implying that Sauron's ring and Envaranat both have unseen driving forces that affect their wielders for their own purposes and endgames. In this case, did the One Ring, wanting to finally no longer be in the dark caves of the Misty Mountains with a creature eating raw fish, influence Bilbo with the needed desire to pick it up and escape with it, and potentially unlock Bilbo's wisdom to defeat Gollum in a contest of riddles? Now we know that Galadriel the elf, played by Cate Blanchett, did say at the beginning of the film that the ring did not expect to be picked up by an unlikely hobbit. However, when it was picked up by the unexpected hobbit, did it then influence Bilbo? Or was it simply the natural resilience of the hobbits in this universe that allowed him to speak his way out of trouble using the power of words, or persuasion that hold power in the Norse world, Tolkien's world, and in our world? Or was it a mix of both? So maybe a weird bridge into this episode, but I am going to be discussing the Norse god Odin and Bilbo Baggins's own powers with words, specifically in their quote skills in the games of riddles. And I'll discuss whether or not they bend the rules a tad to win or to get what they happen to want in that moment. In Odin's case, we know that he simply wants to know and learn everything, and we see that often in the myths. For instance, in the poem Havamal, he states that he hung himself for 9 days from the tree Yggdrasil to learn the runes, or written language, which also holds power in this world. In another case, he awakens the dead Circe in the poem Völuspá to learn the future and her cosmic knowledge about the universe, where we have touched on as being the point where he probably found out about Ragnarok, along with his death and the deaths of most of his kin. And then you have the story of the Mead of Poetry, where he expands his LinkedIn profile to say he can understand and master poetry, or verbal language. Instead of posting that he got these skills from the Mead of Poetry, Odin stated that he just got the certificate in poetry from Udemy because it was marked down to $14.99 from $79.99, and because he did not want to post on LinkedIn that he stole the mead from the giantess Gunlod after seducing her and sleeping with her. So did Odin use a form of his power of words in a riddle contest, primarily with another being of immense knowledge, the giant Vafthrûdnir? Yes. They have a contest where they ask each other questions about the universe. And Odin has an interesting tactic where he bends the rules a tad to win. And in doing so, he is able to have sort of the prestige or the perception of having more wisdom than this giant, even if he really did not do anything to show he actually knows more about the universe. And we know, and this is not unlike in our own world, the perception of an individual also holds a lot of power or influence for that individual, even in this case, if the perception of somebody isn't anything tangible. As far as Bilbo, he also bends the rules to win, not unlike Odin, on a technicality in his contest of riddles in the dark with Gollum. Though in Bilbo's case, he was not a god, but just a simple hobbit, not driven by any desire to be powerful or perceived as powerful, which is a defining trait of hobbits. Their humility and simple lifestyles are rarely guided by ego, which, funny enough, is something that Tolkien emphasized as a part of what made them worthy of heroism. For Bilbo, however, his modification was much simpler: to escape Gollum's cave with his life, finish the adventure that Gandalf had pushed him into, and get back to Bag End to drink tea and read his books. Now, to be fair, and I don't want to make it seem like this powerful wizard Gandalf just needed a small body and wanted to put his quote friend in danger, because some part of Bilbo did want to go on this journey. And that spark of curiosity beyond his life in the Shire is what made him agree to go in the first place, even though Gandalf, in his own words, did give Bilbo a little nudge out the door. But by the time Bilbo is in the Misty Mountains, survival is really all that is on his mind while navigating this conversation slash game with Gollum. I bring this up because both Bilbo and his nephew Frodo, those simple hobbits, share that same curiosity about the world beyond the Shire, a drive to explore the unknown. And in that way, they're not completely unlike us humans, even if they are looked at a certain way by their kin. But anyway, that last note isn't overly relevant for this episode. Once again, in their respected riddle contests, Odin and Bilbo, either driven by primal urges to be better or to save their own lives, will go to any lengths to win on pretty much what are all technicalities. Though at the end of the day, in the record books and in the annals of history, if there happens to be a 38-year-old podcaster still talking about these characters, they will always have a W next to their names in these contests. And at the end of the day, in this game of life, real life and the board game, that may be all that matters when it comes to leaving behind your legacy. We talked about Odin's blood legacy ad nauseum in this podcast, with his royal descendants serving as the remnants of what he leaves behind on this world. And as we know, Bilbo also wanted to leave behind his legacy when he started his book, There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins, after his adventures with Gandalf and the dwarves. Now, to get into the content of this episode, we are going to focus primarily on two riddle contests in the Eddas and sagas involving Odin, specifically against Vafthrûdnir in the poetic Edda poem Vafthrûdnismal, and his brief cameo in the saga of Hervor and Headric, where he goes against the wise king Headric. Then we will discuss the chapter of the Hobbit called Riddles in the Dark to highlight Bilbo's contest, then compare his and Odin's similarities in strategy despite their considerable differences. So let's get started with Vafthrûdnismal from the Poetic Edda, which begins with Odin talking to his wife, the goddess Frigg. He says that he simply wants to visit the giant Vafthrûdnir's hall, whose name literally means riddle weaver, to test his wisdom, though by the end we will see that there's probably more to it. Frigg spends a whole stanza urging him just to stay home, but a couple stanzas later basically gives up, saying, "Fine, be safe, I'll just have the girls over to drink wine and watch the hunting wives." So Odin heads out, not in any danger at first, just following one of his usual whims. Odin arrives at Vafthrûdnir's hall disguised as a being that, per Jackson Crawford, is named Good Advisor, and the giant immediately agrees to Odin's contest. But in stanza 7 makes it clear that Odin may have made a mistake with his visit, saying, "You won't leave my hall unless you prove yourself to be even wiser than I am." So despite the warning, Vafthrûdnir still shows some hospitality and invites him to sit, share his hearth and fire, and Odin does, though he still does not say who he actually is. The contest begins. Now, with the Eddas, I want to make a note here, you often see the authors use the dialogues between two characters to serve as world building for the readers, allowing them to learn more about the Norse universe. As these two characters ask each other questions about the universe, this poem does just that for the reader, and thus is very valuable to better understanding the mythology. So Odin and Vafthrûdnir get right into it and begin asking each other about the cosmos, and whoever fails to answer a question loses. For the first 10 stanzas, Vafthrûdnir asks Odin about the names of horses who guide the patterns of night and day, certain rivers of the world, and the name of the location of the final battle at Ragnarok, all which Odin answers correctly. Then it is Odin's turn. Odin asks the giant about the creation of the universe, which, as we know, Odin literally orchestrated, funny enough. He also asks questions about how night and day work and how the moon waxes and wanes, along with asking about the seasons as well. Odin continues to ask questions and then asks for more knowledge on the events surrounding Ragnarok, where Vafthrûdnir goes into specifics on the rebirth afterwards, where some gods and humans live on. With stanza 51, Vafthrûdnir confirming that Odin's sons Vidar and Vali would live on, Thor's sons Modi and Magni would live on as well, and then they would wield Thor's hammer Mjolnir. Odin, again not presenting himself as Odin, then asks about Odin's death, and the giant confirms that Fenrir the wolf, and as we know, son of Loki, would swallow him whole. So I get the vibe here that Odin's motivation in coming to Vafthrûdnir's hall was also to confirm what the dead witch in Völuspá had already told him. He started out by testing the giant's knowledge with the creation of the universe, but then goes into specifics of his own fate that were previously outlined by the witch. Now, keep in mind, Odin is not allowed to leave unless he shows he has more knowledge than Vafthrûdnir. And at this point, he seems content with the knowledge that he already gained from the giant and he wants to go home. So he then asks Vafthrûdnir in stanza 54, I have traveled so much, I have tried much, and I have often tested the mighty. What did Odin whisper in Baldur's ear before he placed him on the pyre? Vafthrûdnir at this point understands who he is speaking to, the god Odin, and thus knows that Odin asked the question that only Odin would know. Vafthrûdnir closes the poem saying, No one knows what you said in those ancient days, in your son's ear. I have spoken my aged wisdom. I have told you of Ragnarok. I have spoken with a doomed mouth. Now I know that I wagered my head against Odin's in wisdom. But you, Odin, are forever the wisest of all. So Odin technically wins. He is able to leave, and the giant, true to his word, concedes. And apparently the terms that whoever were to lose would die. Not just that Odin needed to win to be allowed to leave with his life. If I were Vafthrûdnir, I would not have accepted personal anecdotes when setting the rules of this game. However, Odin played by the rules outlined in their contest and won because nobody said he could not ask this question. Again, part of Odin's claim to test himself against this wise giant probably had some truth to it. However, it also seems that he came to confirm what he already feared after his son Baldur's prophesied death came true. Not unlike when Odin went to hell before Baldur's death to see if his upcoming death were true as well, as shown in the poem Baldur's Drama, which involves Odin awaking and speaking to another dead witch to learn shit about the future. Odin, just let the dead rest, bro. Anyway, now let's go into the saga of Hervor and Hedrick. Without going too far into the specifics of this story, the two primary characters are Hervor and her son Hedrick. 3 episodes ago, I discussed the character of Ivar the Wide Conqueror, who was a king of many lands via conquest, who is also an ancestor of Ragnar Lothbrok, the primary character in the TV show Vikings. Ragnar and his wife Aslog were the legendary ancestors of the historical kings in Scandinavia. So Ivar is an ancestor of them as well. So Heodric and his mother Hervor, 5 and 6 generations above Ivar, if looking at a family tree, were ancestors of Scandinavia as well. Now, as far as the main story of this saga, it actually involves another magical artifact created by the dwarves, that being the sword Turfing. This sword was essentially unstoppable in battle, and its wielder would always find himself the victor in battle. One condition, however, is that if the sword is drawn, it can only be sheathed once it kills a man. King Sigurlami in the Rus territory was given this sword by some dwarves, And this sword remains in their family for a bit and eventually goes to Sigurlami's grandson Angantyr, who dies and is seemingly buried with it. His daughter, Hervor, needed to summon her dead father to get his sword, and she did. And not unlike the ring Andvaranat, Angantyr warns his daughter, Hervor, about this magical item created by the dwarves, that her son, Heodric, would indeed become the most famous of men, however, also noted that the sword would destroy her family. This warning does hold true. Heodric does become a well-renowned king in Rhaetskataland. As king, he seems to have created a law that vowed to be fair in all court judgments. However, he also vowed for some reason that anyone on trial who defeated him in a game of riddles would walk free. At one point during Heodric's reign, he calls on a powerful but probable criminal he hated to come to his hall to be judged for his crimes, or else he'd be killed. This man's name is Gestum Blindi. Gestum Blindi, upon being served the king's summons, knew that the odds were against him here. So he decided to make a sacrifice to the Allfather Odin himself for help. Odin agrees, and Odin, disguised as Gestum Blindi, goes to Heodric's court. King Heodric informed Gestum Blindi / Odin that he would suffer his judgment, or he could get out of his punishment by beating the king in a game of riddles. So Odin gets into another riddle contest without his opponent knowing who he is, this time with King Heodric. The contest goes on for a bit, and the first thing that came to my mind after rereading this saga for this episode was that maybe King Heodric was a little too lenient with his law code that allowed people to walk free if they stumped him on a riddle, because all 30 questions were directed at the king and not the other way around. So is it exactly 30 questions that the defendants in Heodric's kingdom get? Or was it infinite as long as Heodric was entertained enough by the questions for him to want to keep playing? I am not sure. Anyway, at first, Odin's riddles are fun, lighthearted questions on things or creatures in the world. Questions that I personally probably would have crashed out on after hearing the first one, but questions you would have expected to hear from your classmates playing on the playground while in school, or colleagues around the water cooler when you're at your desk thinking it surely must be at least 1 o'clock in the afternoon, only to look at your watch and see it is 10:30 in the morning, so you decide to go to the water cooler to pass 5 more minutes of your time to try and run up the clock a bit for the end of the workday. For example, for the first riddle, Gestum Blindi / Odin says, "I wish I had what I had yesterday. You know what it was. The squeezer out of songs, the stopper of words, and the caster out of words. King Heodric, consider the riddle."
"Your riddle is good, Gestum Blindi, and I've guessed it. Bring him beer. It lames the wisdom of many, and many are made wordier, and for some it weighs down the tongue so they will not speak a word."
Another example, for the sixth riddle, Gestum Blindi says, "What kind of wonder did I see outside before Delin's doors? It had 8 feet, but 4 eyes, and knees higher than its belly. King Heodric, consider the riddle." Now, this one you actually may have heard something similar to growing up. King Heodric answers correctly by simply saying,
"That's a spider, bro. Any other brain busters?"
However, as the contest continues, the questions get a little weirder and more specific, and this is by design, because Odin just loves to make his appearance known in very theatric ways, often planting seeds for those in his surroundings who will eventually figure out his true identity. He somewhat does this in the poem Harbard's Laud and definitely in Grimnismal, for example, the latter of which he was more direct with his revelation, kind of like Gene Parmesan in the show Arrested Development, taken disguises only to reveal himself after causing initial confusion for comedic purposes. Now, question 26 is where it really gets good. Odin says, "What kind of wonder did I see outside before Delin's doors? It had 10 tongues, 20 eyes, 40 feet, and that creature walked. King Heodric, consider the riddle." The king then says,
"If you are Gestum Blindi like I thought, then you are wiser than I anticipated. You are talking about the sow in the yard, are you not?"
So, a sow is a female pig that has had piglets. But how can a pig have 20 eyes and 40 feet? The king orders the sow cut open and sees it was pregnant with 9 piglets. So the one sow and 9 piglets would equal these number of body parts. How did Gestum Blindi know how many unborn piglets there were? Certainly, it could be a wise god that loves to take disguises in his adventures who figured it out. The king, as we know, seems to be smart. puts two and two together, and the text confirms that he started to suspect that he was in a game of riddles with the Allfather. The 29th question is, who are the two who have 10 feet, 3 eyes, and 1 tail? King Hedrick, consider the riddle. And then immediately King Hedrick says,
That is when Odin rides Sleipnir.
so surprisingly in this podcast, I do not believe I have mentioned Odin's only one eye. Odin only has one eye because he sacrificed the other eye so he could drop it into his uncle Mimir's well, which of course allowed him to receive knowledge and wisdom. With Odin's motivations to drink and know things like Tyrion of the House of Lannister, drinking from his uncle's well and sacrificing his eye to learn more seemed like a good trade-off to him. His horse Sleipnir, and also Loki's son, had 8 legs, hence the 10 legs and 3 eyes. Then to close out the contest, Odin pulls out his trump card out of his back pocket and says, Tell me this last. If you are wiser than every king, what did Odin say in Baldur's ear before he put him on the funeral pyre? This question he knows that nobody probably knows, as confirmed previously by Vafthrûdnir. Hedrick, pissed off about being tricked, then attacks Odin with the cursed sword Tyrfing. However, Odin turns into a falcon and flies away, escaping. Odin, in revenge for the king's attack, curses Hedrick to be killed by his slaves. And in the first paragraph of the next chapter, he indeed was. Now, before I go into The Hobbit to discuss Bilbo's similar approach to winning riddle contests, I did want to say that in Gylfaginning of Snorri's Prosetta, chapter 49 specifically, goes over the details of Baldur's funeral, along with Odin's role in the ceremony. However, Odin does not say anything. It says that he was first there with his wife, Frigg, his Valkyries, and his ravens, Hugin and Munin. The text says, Odin laid the gold ring Draupnir on the pyre. It had the characteristics afterward that every 9th night 8 gold rings of equal weight dripped from it. Baldur's horse, with all its riding gear, was led onto the pyre. This is Jesse Bayek's translation, and the text does not record Odin saying anything at all during the ceremony. Maybe Odin didn't say anything. If I would have had to guess, I would say the correct answer is that he said nothing. Probability-wise, this answer would make sense when you consider the infinite possibilities of any words that Odin could have said at that moment. And I personally think that Odin would find it funny to stump others with something that could have been obvious. Odin at his son's funeral could have been internalizing his thoughts and his grief, remaining silent and saying goodbye to his son. Now, regarding his ring Draupnir, which is another ring created by the dwarves, it also generates wealth for its owner, as it replicates itself into other golden rings. When Envarinat was owned by the dwarf Envari, it also generated wealth for him. Another similarity between 2 magic rings in the Norse universe that were created by these dwarves. Now onto the Hobbit chapter, Riddles in the Dark. Essentially, the Hobbit starts with Bilbo Baggins, uncle of Frodo, who features in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, chilling at Bag End in the Shire, only for Gandalf to arrive one day to nudge Bilbo out the door on an adventure with 12 dwarves. The party needed Bilbo to act as a stealthy thief due to his small size on a mission. The mission was to the Lonely Mountain, and its aim was to reclaim the kingdom within the mountain so it could be given back to the dwarves, who were trying to reclaim their homelands. However, the kingdom was being occupied by a dragon named Smaug, who was hoarding a lot of wealth there. Obviously, a dragon being there would be an issue. We discussed in previous weeks Smaug being inspired by Fafnir the dragon from the story with the Volsungs. Anyway, on this adventure, Bilbo, the 12 dwarves, and Gandalf find themselves in a fight for survival with a bunch of goblins while beneath another mountain range, not the Lonely Mountain, but the Misty Mountains. In the ensuing chaos, Bilbo falls and finds himself alone in the tunnels, wondering how to get back to his companions. That is where chapter 5 of The Hobbit, again called Riddles in the Dark, starts. And this is also the introduction of the One Ring that we all know and love. As Bilbo begins to get his bearings, early in the chapter it says, His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even in the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, and he did not know it. And boy, after roughly 25 hours of expanded content between 6 films, not even taking into account the Amazon series, I believe it. Also, like Odin and Loki with Envarinot, Bilbo instinctively takes it. The text says, "He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly, it did not seem of any particular use at the moment." However, we find that Bilbo was not actually alone because he fell into the very dwelling of the creature Gollum. Gollum notices Bilbo and immediately notices how delicious Bilbo looks for eating, initially thinking that Bilbo was another goblin, beings that he also ate. You find out in Gollum's own words later that he puts on the ring, which makes him invisible, to ambush goblins so he could eat their flesh. And as mentioned, he would also eat fish. In his underground lair below the Misty Mountains, there was also a lake, and Gollum primarily stayed on an island in the middle of that lake, and he had a boat to get to and from other parts of the caves. Gollum makes his way on his boat towards Bilbo, not knowing that Bilbo had his ring, but after presenting himself, did notice Bilbo's dagger, sensing that if he were to kill and eat Bilbo with brute force, it may be a tougher fight than he thought. Gollum, not entirely hungry yet, though curious, decides to play with his prey and offers to have a game of riddles with Bilbo. Bilbo, obviously on edge and not knowing if Gollum was friendly with the goblins that he and his crew were just fighting against, agreed, though he was still scared out of his mind and he was thinking about ways to get back to his company. So this contest is between Bilbo and Gollum. Now, Gollum did not have much company, and seeing as how he came up with the idea of a riddle contest, you can take a guess that he probably had a lot of time to think about these riddles. And we will see throughout the questions that Bilbo does need to rely on pure luck, perhaps being willed by the ring itself, and relies on a technicality just like Odin. Because as we will see, Gollum shows that he is the stronger riddler, and now I'm sensing a crossover with the Batman universe now. After answering an easy first question, Gollum then gives harsher terms on the contest, offering to tell Bilbo how to get out of the caves if he wins, but him being able to eat Bilbo if Bilbo loses. Bilbo obviously at this point becomes more unnerved, but feels forced to accept it, fearing he would be eaten anyway if not. The first question right before this, by the way, shows that Gollum does not know about plate tectonics. He asked, "What has roots and nobody sees, is taller than trees, up, up, up it goes, and yet it never grows." The answer was mountains. A couple of questions later, Gollum grows a bit more hungry, but is almost stumped. It needs more time to answer, nearly the only time that Gollum almost lost this contest until the end. Bilbo asked him what was a box without hinges, key or lid, yet golden treasure inside it hid. Gollum gets upset, not immediately knowing the answer, and Bilbo asks a couple of times for an answer. Gollum eventually does answer correctly, and the answer was eggs. Then there are two questions that almost stump Bilbo. The first was, "Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking, precious." That's my Gollum impression. I apologize to everyone. Bilbo, not knowing and him now being pressured to answer, demands more time as he gave more time previously to Gollum. Gollum, seeing that his dinner time was almost there, put his foot into the water to make his way towards Bilbo. And as he does this, a scared fish jumps out of the water. Bilbo immediately yelled out that a fish was the answer, and this was correct. How lucky. Gollum's next question also stumped Bilbo. It was, "This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountains down." Bilbo grows scared as he doesn't know the answer. Gollum senses this and approaches Bilbo again. Bilbo attempts to ask for more time, but he was so scared that nothing came out of his mouth except squeaking the word, "Time, time!" This too was the correct answer, because as we all know, Father Time defeats us all. Bilbo was lucky as fuck once again. Gollum was growing aggravated and hangry at this point. He sat down close to Bilbo and began poking him a little bit, making the hobbit even more uneasy to the point where he now had trouble thinking of a riddle. Gollum demanded a riddle, and Bilbo became even more afraid to the point where he tried to pinch and slap himself into having some sense. He also, as a security blanket, gripped his dagger and felt in his pocket with his other hand, feeling the ring. Bilbo then instinctively asks himself, again, not Gollum, what have I got in my pocket? Gollum thinks that that was the question in the riddle and immediately grows pissed off. Unlike Vafthrûdnir, he did not like this supposed tactic to win. Bilbo at this point realizes that he may have won on this technicality, though, and he asks the same question, this time to Gollum. Gollum, in his desperation, makes a few guesses, but fails to guess the answer. Bilbo, knowing that he has Gollum beat, gives him one more chance. And funny enough, Gollum here does answer the word nothing, incorrectly answering. Gollum does accept defeat. I'm kidding, he begins crashing out, and after he collects his wits, Bilbo demands to be shown the way out of the cave since rules are rules, and he won. Gollum pretends to agree, but tells Bilbo that he needs to row back out to his island in the cave to get prepared for the path on the way out. But in reality, he wanted to get his ring, so he could turn invisible and kill Bilbo. Gollum rows out to the island. While he does this, the text states that the ring was actually a ring of power and would grant invisibility to those who wear it. Gollum says this out loud for some reason. So Gollum obviously cannot find his ring. However, he immediately suspects that that was what was in Bilbo's pocket. Gollum becomes hysterical and begins to weep for losing his precious and his birthday present, since it came to him on his birthday centuries ago. Bilbo also heard Gollum state that the ring's power is that the wearer becomes invisible. Gollum collects himself again and goes to the tunnels to find Bilbo. Bilbo, however, had not gone into the tunnels, but being unseen follows Gollum through the tunnels, assuming that that would be the actual way out. He eventually puts the ring on and becomes invisible. There was also an interesting moment where Bilbo considers killing Gollum, however, he decided not to. In the end, Bilbo got through both Gollum and a bunch of goblins to get back into the light where he would eventually reunite with his crew. So, anyway, here we have riddle contests with both Odin the Allfather and Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, a divine god and a humble but heroic hobbit winning their respective riddle contests against a giant, a king, and Gollum. They have their own reasons for being in these situations where they need to display their power of art of words. With Odin, he voluntarily puts himself in these situations, and with Bilbo, not so much. However, the manner in which they win their contest and then get to keep on keeping on is very similar. Odin has his question in his back pocket to trick his adversary, and Bilbo accidentally falls into tricking his. However, in both cases, Odin and Bilbo take the W, and the history books will reflect that. Bilbo lives on with the ring to pass it to his nephew Frodo decades later, eventually ending with Frodo and Gollum's actions, leading to its destruction, which saves the world. And Odin lives on until his final days in death at Ragnarok, but not before seeding the world with his offspring. So both won without actually asking their opponents a riddle. However, the rules never said that they couldn't. So why not bend, but not break the rules to survive another day? And that is really the heart of this comparison. Odin bends the rules because he can, in what is probably his little game, while Bilbo bends them because he has to. But it's worth noting that he may have not been doing this entirely alone. As we saw, the ring was already beginning to exert its subtle pull, allowing Bilbo to win by luck, and in one case, having the fish jump out of the water. So whether we call this fate, chance, or the ring choosing its new bearer, Bilbo had help from a power far beyond himself. And just like in these mythic and literary contests, our own world is full of these, quote, wins that come from quirks in the system rather than overwhelming strength. Often these mechanisms are legitimate and even necessary. Procedures, rules, guardrails meant to keep things running, but they can also get stretched right to the limit in ways that quietly shape outcomes. And you really see this everywhere. In sports, for example, think about all those big rivalry matches where everything hinges on one controversial call. A tight offside ruling in a Barcelona-Real Madrid match, or a VAR decision that awards a late penalty, not because one team truly dominated, but because the system's gray area tipped the scale a bit. Somebody walks away with the win, but everybody watching knows the margin came from perhaps a subjective interpretation, not a raw superiority. Politics also work the same way. Modern US elections are full of outcomes influenced less by who convinced more voters and more by structural maneuvers, gerrymandered districts, carefully timed procedural delays, or billionaires who amplify their preferred candidates through targeted funding. Even the way we talk about issues mirrors this. Outrage cycles, straw man arguments, and quick labels often let one side, quote, win the discourse or the debate without ever meaningfully engaging. So not all of this is always malicious. Systems can create weird pressure points, and humans poke at them. But like Bilbo stumbling into advantage because the ring nudged events, or Odin steering a contest from inside rules he pretends to follow, these subtle moves can have real impacts on other people. And on a small everyday level, we all do this too. We also bend rules without necessarily breaking them. We use cleverness, timing, and lucky instinct to survive the day and to provide for our family and spouses, which, funny enough, the symbol of connections with our spouses are rings, figuratively and not literally influencing us in this case. In those moments, we are not unlike Bilbo in the cave or a little Odin playing his games, walking around in disguise only to reveal himself in a theatric fashion, simply navigating a world that does not always play fair, with us often using our skills and words or powers and persuasion in this game. And this power is certainly an art form that some are better than others at in this world. Anyway, I'm not trying to be on a soapbox or profound with this closing, but one thing I do love about these stories with gods and fictional characters is how the messages can definitely apply to our own lives and contain magical rings, dragons, gods, and somehow still be relevant for the readers/listeners. That's all I had for today. In our next episode, we are going to shift from riddles to parental relationships, specifically the dynamic between Odin and Thor as father and son. We'll break down the poem All This Small, where Thor essentially wins a contest in a way that would make his father proud by not actually engaging in a contest, but winning in that moment anyway using his words. And we're going to pair that with two moments from, once again, The Hobbit, specifically one moment where Bilbo, Gandalf, and the dwarves need to get out of a sticky situation with trolls, and another where they just needed a place to stay. All moments where clever manipulation of time, words, and power mirror the old Norse stories. And once again, in these worlds and our own, these subtle games we play with words often work, either as a billionaire on social media or when we are at work sending an email stating we didn't finish an obligation on time. Thank you for listening. I will see you then. Thank you for listening to Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. If you enjoyed the show, please follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you, and have a great day.